So thank you for listening to this webcast. And I will start off this presentation with general information about Title IX and the complaint process. Next, I will discuss the guidance that the Office of Civil Rights has provided to help athletic programs comply with Title IX. And I will also cover aspects of the guidance that are not applicable to club and intramural sports. During that discussion, I will talk about some of the recommendations that my colleagues and I have advanced. I will end the webcast with information about Title IX protections for transgender students. So what is Title IX? So Title IX is a portion of the United States Education Amendments of 1972. It states in part that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So this applies to almost all private and public institutions, including primary and secondary schools, colleges and universities, and it also includes libraries and museums that receive federal funds. Now, there are some private elementary and secondary schools that do not receive any federal money, but the majority of private and public higher education institutions do receive some form of federal assistance, usually in the form of federal financial aid for students. Because Title IX only addresses public and private schools that receive federal funding, several states have enacted similar laws to prohibit discrimination based on sex, regardless of whether the school receives federal funding. And so I encourage all of the listeners to investigate their state laws. It is important to understand that Title IX covers the entire institution. So that's all departments, programs, and activities that are in that institution. They have to comply with Title IX. At one time, so in 1984, the Supreme Court ruled in Grove City College versus Bell that Title IX applied only to programs that directly received federal aid. So this made a lot of people involved in men's athletics happy because they were outside the reach of Title IX because their athletic program did not directly receive any federal funds. This joy didn't last long, however, because the Civil Rights Restoration Act was passed in 1988, and it extended Title IX coverage to all programs of any educational institution that receives federal assistance, whether directly or indirectly. But some social fraternities and sororities, and then also some sex-specific youth clubs such as Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, they are exempt from Title IX requirements. And there are some institutions that had exemptions from some Title IX regulations because of religious reasons. And I will discuss that at the end of this presentation. And so it's interesting that when people think of Title IX, the majority think of athletics. But in the hearings about Title IX, there was very little mention of athletics. The focus was more on the hiring and employment practices in regards to the opportunities that women had. And in fact, when President Nixon signed the bill, he spoke more about desegregating the school buses, which was also part of the educational amendments. And so Title IX is bigger than athletics. It focuses on admissions, recruitment, financial aid, academics, recreation, student treatment and services, discipline, sexual assault and harassment, and also the education of pregnant and parenting students, among other programs and activities. And so athletics is only one area, but it has become the elephant in the room and the focus of Title IX dialogue. And this actually started around 1973 when Sports Illustrated reported that the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which we know now as the Department of Education, Sports Illustrated reported that they were trying to decide if all college sport teams should be open to both sexes or if there should be separate but equal programs. So basically there was a fear that women might be allowed to play football with men. And so in 1974, Senator John Tower, he introduced the Tower Amendment, which would have exempted revenue-producing sports like football and basketball from Title IX compliance. But later that year, the Tower Amendment was rejected and the Javits Amendment proposed by Senator Jacob Javits, he stated that the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare must include reasonable provisions considering the nature of particular sports. And so some sports may have more expensive equipment or uniforms, or may have bigger facilities based on need, and they would still be in compliance with the law. And so if someone has a Title IX complaint, they can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights State Enforcement Office, or they can use the OCR online complaint form. It has to be submitted within 180 days of the date of the alleged discrimination act. They can also file an internal grievance, and if they are not happy with the outcome, they would have 60 days after the institutional grievance process ends to file a complaint with OCR. And so the Office of Civil Rights, they will attempt to obtain voluntary compliance, and they'll try to negotiate remedies. But if the institution still will not comply, they will refer the case to the Department of Justice to seek withdrawal of federal funds. As of 2014, though, this has not happened. So does this mean that every institution is in compliance? Definitely not. But the Office of Civil Rights, they don't have sufficient staff and even budget to fully enforce Title IX. So what do they do to help institutions remain compliant then? So in regards to athletics, OCR has issued Federal Register notices, memorandums, Dear Colleague letters, and pamphlets to help institutions. And these can be found online in the OCR Reading Room. One of these documents is the Intercollegiate Athletic Policy Interpretation that was issued in 1979. The interpretation focuses on college varsity athletics, but states its general principles will often apply to club, intramural, and interscholastic athletic programs, which are covered by regulation. And so the majority of the guidance and examples only focus on intercollegiate athletics and fails to include any unique aspects of club and intramural sport programs. OCR also developed a Title IX athletics investigation manual, but it only discussed the investigation process for intercollegiate and interscholastic athletics, with no information about the approach that OCR would use when they're investigating club and intramural sport programs. And then also, there was a clarification of the 1979 policy guidance that was issued in 1996, but it also focused primarily on intercollegiate athletics. And so in my opinion, this is a gross omission because there are over 7 million students competing in intramural and club sports. And so the government should want to make sure that there is gender equity. This lack of any specific guidance in regards to club and intramural sports has left many campus recreation staff asking which regulations are appropriate, which ones are not. Okay. And so given the limited guidance from OCR, I conducted an investigation with Erin Morris, who is currently a doctoral student in the Department of Recreation, Sport, and Tourism at the University of Illinois, and then also with Robin Dietering, Terrence Elmore, and Edward Morford in the Division of Campus Rec at the University of Illinois. And so we wanted to critically assess the relevancy of current Title IX athletic guidance to intramural and club sports, and also develop gender equity guidelines specific to these sports. And so we reviewed sections 45 of Title IX of the Education Amendments. We also looked at the policy interpretation, and we looked at the 1996 clarification of intercollegiate athletics, the 3-part test. These documents provide a lot of details about the program components that OCR would investigate for Title IX violations. And so there are 13 program components listed in the Title IX regulation and then also the 1979 policy interpretation that might be investigated by OCR. Please note that these 13 components are not considered to be a finite list. Now, in this presentation, I will only discuss the ones that are not deemed appropriate for club and intramural sport programs. but the guidelines that we have developed do encompass all 13 of these components. So first, the policy interpretation provides guidance to help institutions be compliant with Title IX in relation to giving scholarships to athletes based on athletic ability. The scholarships have to be given out in proportion to the number of students of each sex participating in intercollegiate athletics. And so this guidance is not applicable to club and intramural sports, as scholarships are not provided to participants. But providing proportionally equal amounts of financial assistance to men and women's athletic programs, that can be applied to club and intramural programs. But we do not think it should be based on participation rates. So allocating financial assistance based on previous year's participation rates, it can result in financial inequities. As in most institutions, intramural and club sport teams, their participation numbers are not set. And so depending on the institution, the rosters may be limited or unlimited. And so participation rates could fluctuate significantly each year. So hence, it's recommended that for club and intramural sports, proportionally equal amounts of financial assistance be first made available based on the sex composition of the institution's undergraduate population. And then when participation rates are known, equity can then be ensured by providing financial assistance proportionate to the participation rates and in consideration of operation costs. Also, Title IX guidance does not provide any guidance for participation costs. So athletes in club and intramural programs at many institutions, they bear some or all of the financial costs of supporting the program. And regulations specific to intramural and club sport programs should require that institutions distribute the participation costs impartially to men and women, with neither sex bearing a disparate financial obligation. Now, it's known that some sports will have higher participation costs than other sports, but these costs must be determined by the financial operating costs, not in regard to the sex of the predominant participation group. Additionally, unlike intercollegiate athletics, institutions do not recruit athletes or provide and compensate academic tutors or provide housing and dining facilities and services for your intramural and your club sport athletes. Coaches are also not provided for intramural sports, but some institutions do provide compensation or support for club sport coaches. Thus, in accordance with the intercollegiate policy, if a school does provide financial support for coaches, female, male, and co-ed club teams should be provided with equivalent coaching assignments and compensation in terms of quality, nature, and availability of coaches. Also, the law has to consider that club teams determine how they'll spend their funds. So thus, teams' equipment and supplies, their practice and competition times and facilities, and travel arrangements, they might be unequal based on their own choice, not based on discrimination. So for example, if a female club chooses to spend its allocated money on travel, and a male club team chooses to spend allocated money on equipment, the male club might have more and better equipment. Intercollegiate guidance also recommends that the methods of determining ability take into account team performance records. But for intramural sports, team performance records cannot be used to determine ability due to the capricious nature of intramural teams. Within most divisions, a team will choose the level of competition that best meets their interests and their ability levels. And finally, the policy interpretation also calls for participation opportunities for male and female students to be provided in numbers substantially proportionate to their respective enrollments. And I want to point out that this is just one way institutions can be in compliance with Title IX. So as highlighted in the 1996 clarification of intercollegiate athletics policy guidance, their three-part test, they can also demonstrate a history and continuing practice of program expansion for the underrepresented sex, or they can accommodate the interests and the abilities of the underrepresented sex. And so they don't just have to meet the proportionality test. They can choose one of those three different avenues. So the substantial proportionality test, it can be used for intramural sport. However, because institutions have different intramural structures, we recommend that an assessment of gender equity be measured by the number of playing spots or the number of leagues, not the number of participants, because in some institutions, as I mentioned, it's unlimited, where in others, it might be limited. For club sports, the substantial proportionality test cannot be used. Club teams are formed primarily as a result of students' interests and abilities. Therefore, in many institutions, one sex may be underrepresented compared to their undergraduate enrollment, but it's definitely not a result of discrimination policies or practices. It's more because of a result of student interests and their abilities. I would also like to point out that in the selection of sports, the intercollegiate athletics regulation, it does not require institutions to integrate their teams, nor to provide exactly the same choice of sports to men and women. Moreover, a lot of people are unaware that with non-contact sports, schools must either allow women to try out for the men's team or offer an equivalent separate team. But when it comes to contact sports, schools are not obligated to do either. And so this includes boxing, wrestling, rugby, ice hockey, football, basketball, and in other sports in which the purpose or main activity involves bodily contact. But in order to fully accommodate student interests, even though this is not a requirement of the law, we strongly recommend that for intramural sports, that if there is a sufficient interest, institutions should provide the same choices. And co-ed opportunities should be provided if there is not enough interest to establish a separate league. Now, if there is insufficient registration for a league and co-ed opportunities are not provided, we recommend that the excluded sex be given the opportunity to participate in the opposite sex league. And this is regardless if it is a contact or a non-contact sport. Additionally, as we were going through OCR's guidelines, we noticed no mention of transgender students. And so as the growing number of persons in the United States are identifying as transsexual or transgender, it was important that we include guidelines for administrators in regards to these populations. And so first I want to cover a few definitions. So first, transgender, narrowly defined, it describes a person whose gender identity, which is one's psychological identification as a boy or girl or as a man or a woman, does not match the person's sex at birth. Transfemale is someone who is assigned a male sex at birth but has a female gender identity, and transmale is someone who is assigned a female sex at birth but has a male gender identity. And less than 20 states offer protections for discrimination and harassment based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And some states only provide it just for sexual orientation. And so I strongly encourage you to please investigate your state laws on this issue. But there are federal protections even if you do not have state protection. In regards to federal protections, a transgender person can seek protection from discrimination, harassment, and violence with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And originally, with this act, protection was offered based on sex discrimination and harassment. But in 2012, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission they explicitly stated that employment discrimination on the basis of gender identity and transgender status was prohibited. Also, if passed by the House, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act will provide protection against workplace discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And so this act passed the Senate in November 2013, but is still waiting for House approval. There's also the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act that prohibits bias-motivated violence because of a person's race, color, religion, national origin, disability, and it also includes sexual orientation and gender identity. And then we have Title IX. So prior to 2014, with using Title IX, a claim could be based on gender expression and stereotyping. But as of April 29, 2014, a guidance issued by the Office of Civil Rights in relation to sexual violence, it explicitly mentioned that transgender individuals are protected by Title IX. The law, however, did not provide a lot of specifics or comprehensive guidance about what this protection looks like. And so it's currently being addressed with individual lawsuits, and the protections can vary by institution and also by state. It's also important to know that the Department of Education can exempt colleges from rules that violate their religious beliefs. And so, for example, George Fox University, a Christian college in Oregon, they received an exemption to Title IX in relation to housing. So specifically, the university does not have to permit a transgender student to stay in a dorm based on his or her gender identity. The decision can be based on their birth sex. And then George Fox University, they only focused on a housing exemption, but Spring Arbor University in Michigan and Simpson University in California, they have exemptions for admissions, housing, restrooms, athletics, and more. So basically, they can deny a transgender student admission into their university, and the student can even be expelled if he later on identifies as being transgender. And so my colleagues and I, we recommend that transgender students be provided equal opportunity to participate in intramural sports based on his or her gender identity, regardless of medical treatment. Now, this is different from the NCAA policy that states that trans males on testosterone, that they can compete on male or co-ed teams only, and trans females on testosterone suppression drugs, that they can compete on men's and co-ed teams, but can only compete on a women's team after 1 year of treatment. If the person is not taking hormones, the NCAA says that trans males can compete on men's or women's teams, but trans females can only compete on men's teams. And so we want to promote full inclusivity at the intramural level. And so we recommend that if the individual is in the process of transitioning to a different gender, participation in a male or female designated sport, it should be handled on a case-by-case basis by the institution. For club sports, we do, however, recommend that transgender students' participation opportunities be based on the sport's national governing body, or schools can use the NCAA regulations, or if they have an official intramural policy in the absence of any external regulations. And so in this presentation, I briefly discussed some of the guidelines and recommendations that my team and I have advanced to help institutions ensure that there is gender equity within their intramural and their club sport programs. The complete detailed guidelines will be distributed in 2015 by NERSA. If you have any questions or comments about the information that I presented in this webcast, please contact me at jmcdowe7@gmu.edu. And so before I end, I would like to say that Title IX has come a long way, And whether it is acknowledged or not, known or not, women and men in U.S. society, in and out of sport, would not be where they are without Title IX. When opportunities are provided, when discrimination is lessened or eradicated, persons have the opportunity to take on identities that they never once realized, or identities that they were once denied. And so Title IX and other civil rights laws have helped us realize the possibilities of our identities. And so it's up to us to make sure that we do our part and not put any hurdles or barriers to progress. And so this concludes the webcast, and I would like to thank you for your time.